The other area I talk a lot about, Jason, is I mentioned national security, and that's a really interesting one. And I focus on nuclear warfighting, and that's a subject I started studying in the late '60s, and a lot of the scholarly work on that was done in the late '50s and the early '60s. So it was pretty fresh stuff. This is during the Cold War, and the thought leaders were Paul Nitze, Roberto Wolstetter, Albert Wolstetter, Henry Kissinger, and the big brain was Herman Kahn. And Herman Kahn came up with a way of understanding nuclear war fighting. Nobody wakes up and says, "Hey, nice day. I think I'll shoot off a nuclear missile." That's not how it happens. It happens through escalation. Somebody provokes somebody, the other side pushes back, they push back some more, and you're climbing the way Khan described, you're climbing a ladder, you're climbing an escalatory ladder. And at the top of the ladder is nuclear annihilation and the end of the human race. So two things to understand. Number one, that is the dynamic. We saw it in the Cuban Missile Crisis and a few other examples I talk about in the book. The other one is, what do you do about that? I don't want to dive into politics, but when I look at Ukraine, you can take sides, do the history, whatever, but it is on an escalatory path. The 2014 Maidan Revolution, the U.S. overthrew a properly elected president. We didn't like him, but we did overthrow him. Russia takes Crimea. The U.S. sends weapons. Russia invades Donbass. The U.S. sends long-range missiles. Next thing you know, things are blowing up in Russia. Again, you don't have to take sides. Just understand that you're on that escalatory ladder. So what do? Khan said, first of all, understand that's what you're doing. 2, take a beat. And 3, de-escalate, climb back down the ladder. And that's what happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And there were 2 other examples. There are a number of other examples. It's kind of frightening how many, but there are 2 others I point to in the book. One was in the early 1980s during the Reagan administration, the KGB actually had artificial intelligence. An early version of it was called VRION, was the name of the system. But what it did, it looked at a long list of factors in the Soviet Union, basically Russia, but the Soviet Union at the time, and the United States. GDP, economic growth, inflation, et cetera, a whole bunch of things, and basically looked at how the U.S. was increasing the power over the Soviet Union. And they looked at the spread, and they said when the spread gets to a certain size, the U.S. may start a nuclear war. Meaning, they if it's close, no way. But if they think they have the edge, here's their chance. They might do it. And the first thing you learn about nuclear war fighting is if you think the other side is going to shoot, you shoot first, because the guy who shoots first wipes out their missiles before they can wipe you out. It's been called 2 scorpions in a bottle. If one scorpion strikes, but the other scorpion has just enough strength left to strike back, and they both die. That's the dynamic. So the Soviet Union determined that the U.S. had opened up the spread. It was getting dangerous. Well, NATO, led by the U.S., was doing a war game at the time. And the war game scenario was a nuclear war. They weren't starting a nuclear war, but they were kind of rehearsing or saying, well, what would happen or how would you do it? How would you do a nuclear war? There were heads of state involved and all that. Well, the KGB is watching this, but they didn't know it was a war game. They said, hey, they're getting ready to do exactly what we thought they were going to do. And it was dangerously close to World War III, nuclear annihilation. And it was a U.S. lieutenant general who saw this and said, he ordered, this is contrary to his orders, he ordered NATO to dial it down. He said, basically de-escalate our own war game as a way of signaling to the Soviet Union that this is not real. And the Soviet Union got the message, and they de-escalated. We narrowly avoided it. There was another case where a Soviet system, again, they were using, this is primitive AI, and primitive by today's standards, but it was AI, where a system gave a launch signal to a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet army. It said, launch the missiles, because we see incoming U.S. nuclear missiles, and they have the doctrine is launch on warning. When you see them coming in, you launch your stuff right away. You don't wait to get hit. But this particular lieutenant colonel had worked on the system, and he knew it was a little funky. And his orders were call your seniors, and that was escalate. And then they probably would have fired the missiles. Who wants to be the one who says don't fire when you're about to get, destroyed? But he didn't. He disobeyed orders. He basically bet his country, the entire Soviet Union, on his hunch. I'll come back to hunch because that's important. On his hunch that there was something wrong with the system, that it was not a nuclear attack. And in particular, they saw 5 missiles coming in. He said, no, if they're attacking, they'll use 100, not 5. Well, it turns out that the system had picked up reflections of the sun in such a way that those reflections look like dots, incoming missiles, etc. And he was later known as the man who saved the world. But here's my point. Both the lieutenant general in the U.S. and the lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Union disobeyed standard operating procedures and their orders, and separately, in 2 cases, may have saved the world from nuclear annihilation. What is that? Well, it's gut instinct, it's common sense, it's intuition, it's a lot of things, but you're betting your country that you're right. Now, here's the problem. I'm sorry to be long-winded, but I'll kind of bring this all together. AI cannot do that. AI can do deductive logic. Deduction is, major premise, minor premise, conclusion, et cetera. There are flaws in it if the major premise is wrong, but it's a kind of logic that works going back to Aristotle. Inductive logic is you just have a whole bunch of cases. You see something everywhere and you draw the inference, well, this must be the way it is, or this must be right because I see it everywhere, although it took a long time for Europeans to find a black swan. They're down in Adelaide, in Australia. I've been there. I've seen them, but that people didn't know that. Westerners at least didn't know that for a long time. So computers can do deductive logic and inductive logic. But there's a third branch of logic that very few people understand called abductive logic. And this was outlined by Charles Sanders Peirce in the 19th century. He's an interesting guy because he was 100 years ahead of his time. So the problem with people like that, it takes 100 years before you can look back and say, hey, he was right. This is a problem. Abductive logic, he was the father of semiotics, which is kind of the cornerstone of philosophy today. But the point is, you can't program it. It is, if I'm trying to summarize it as opposed to presenting a lecture on abductive logic, it's common sense, it's intuition, it's the way you and I get through the day, or humans have got through the day for all of civilization. But you can't program it. And which means if you put artificial intelligence and GPT in the nuclear kill chain and things start escalating, they're going to keep escalating. It's exactly like, all sellers, no buyers, sell everything, get cash, go to the sidelines, except we're talking about nuclear war fighting, where they say escalate, because they're escalating, keep escalating. AI cannot override itself. In other words, it doesn't have common sense. It just has math. And so these are the dangers. And I don't say, go, live in a cave with a machine gun and canned goods or whatever. There are things we can do about it. And I never point to problems without pointing to solutions. And the solution in nuclear warfighting is don't put AI in the kill chain. If you want to have it over here as a research tool, okay, think hard about that. But it's already there. The Chinese are building it. The U.S. is too. But don't put it in the decision-making chain because it will lack the ability to de-escalate and back off when the time comes, which has saved the world in a couple instances, and I talk about them in the book.
Thank you so much for listening to the Selling with Love podcast. We have some previous episodes you can tune into right here. And if you prefer the short form content where you get to the point in under 10 minutes, we do have a ton of clips from our best episodes that are being shared on this channel as well. So pick which one supports you the most. And of course, thank you for liking, subscribing, and of course, selling with love.